Hey, buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Gilbin is the name and Hearthstone is the game, and Blizzard just announced some cool new card consistency updates, and in fact, I would argue some card buffs. That's right, cards are actually getting some improvements, guys. That's unheard of. We only ever see nerfs, but I think these are small, but still very much card buffs. And of course, I have always, like everybody else, complained about some inconsistencies in Hearthstone. So I'm glad Blizzard is finally addressing some of these problems. And specifically, as you'll see, these are generally in regards to tribal effects. So, elementals, beasts, demons, that sorts of things. The tribal tags, the minion type tags, not in regards to card mechanics necessarily or anything like that. That said, I guess let's just go ahead and jump into these because I have a lot I want to talk about. Some good things, some bad things, some good precedents, some potentially dangerous precedents that we've complained about in the past. So I don't want to waste too much time. That said, the first cards up for the change here are Mountain Giant and Molten Giant, both of which are now getting elemental tags because there's one that's made of all rock and one that's made of fiery magma. I guess Blizzard thinks these are the epitome, as they said, of elemental minions, and I'm cool with that. That's a reasonable assumption from lore. Of course, giants aren't always elementals in lore, but in this case, there's a pretty good argument since these are made of elemental components that they should in fact be elementals. More importantly, disregarding the lore from standpoint at some level, I think it's more important that cards are just consistent and predictable to understand. And as long as Blizzard has their mind in that space and they're doing things in a way that makes sense across cards, that's a good thing. I don't care if we always stick 100% perfectly to Warcraft lore, or if minion types always match the tags in World of Warcraft because, mobs in World of Warcraft have certain tags. That's less important to me than the internal environment of Hearthstone. And as long as things are consistent in Hearthstone, that's a plus. So Mountain Giant, Molten Giant, now elementals. And frankly, that's a buff. There are no anti-elemental synergy cards in Hearthstone. There's nothing that says, destroy an elemental. So there's no downside to these cards that I can see. But there is, of course, some upside because now both of these are more viable in elemental synergy decks. So they can do things like empower Frostlich Jaina, for instance, with some extra life steal on a big 8/8 body. That's pretty awesome. They can also, of course, set off the trigger for elementals played in the future turn now, and they couldn't before. Now, obviously, Mountain Giant and Molten Giant aren't being played all that widely in Hearthstone right now in elemental decks because there's not necessarily a reason to. That said, there is actually a deck from Kibler that he's been playing, I've heard, that includes Mountain Giants in an Elemental Mage shell, because, of course, a lot of Elementals draw you cards, fill up your hand. There's some minion draw cards now in Mage as well, so Mountain Giant actually fits fairly well into that environment, and now that it's an Elemental, makes your Jaina way better. Makes it more reliable and consistent that you set off those future elementals. So neat inclusion there. Maybe that deck gets a little bit more traction. It's obviously not a super popular tier 1 deck right now, but at least some immediate impact on the meta. And although the impact might be limited in the case of both of these cards right away, the potential for the future is still there. So they might get played in the future in some elemental deck. There's just more potential, more options for these cards to find a home. So they're both at least a little bit better. This is a slight, but nonetheless very real buff to two cards that have been around for a very long time. So I'm excited to see what the future holds for each of these. I don't know that we're going to ever care that these are elementals, but particularly with Molten Giant, that's going to be in wild format exclusively forever. Well, I guess Mountain Giant's in wild format too, but since wild format in particular just has so many more elementals, and these changes are presumably going to be around forever, there might be a deck, even if it's 5 years down the line, that can create some awesome giant elemental synergy play. In fact, we've seen Giants Mage successfully played in the past with cards like Ice Block. where you, you play an ice block and you stay alive and you play a bunch of Molten Giants and a bunch of other stuff. So maybe Molten Giants work there, where you just play a ton of Molten Giants and you have Jaina, in fact, so they give you lifesteal as well. That could be a pretty cool option in Wild right off the bat. So clearly Mage seems like the standout, but there are always more options as well. Nonetheless, good change, cool change. Buffs to these cards. You may not notice the impact immediately, but hey, at least a couple of the cards in your Hearthstone collection, if you have these, got a little bit better today. And in my mind, that's a good thing. So up next here, we have the Wychwood Piper, which is now going to be classified as a demon. And that makes sense because this is a satyr, and satyrs in WoW are demons. And I think this is the first satyr in Hearthstone. We have some imps. In fact, the article said there was one in like alpha, but as far as the actual game is concerned, this is the first satyr. So Blizzard's setting a pretty good precedent here, making sure this thing lines up as it's supposed to, so future satyr cards, as they're revealed and released, will in fact fall in line. If we ever get like a Xavius card, for instance, we're going to know it's a demon. And of course, once again, for the same reasons previously, this is a buff. And suddenly there are more cards that synergize with the Wychwood Piper than before. For instance, you toss Wychwood Piper into a Gul'dan Warlock deck, and suddenly Blood Reaver Gul'dan will resummon your Wychwood Piper where it wouldn't have before, so it's just an additional body, a free 3/3 perhaps, in the pool. Now, of course, something like Q-Block might not want to run that because it could disrupt the demon pool, but other decks that don't have quite as many demons might appreciate that extra little synergy. So maybe Wychwood Piper finds a home in Warlock right away. Obviously, Warlock has the most demon synergies, so that's the class that would most significantly be impacted by this change. I don't know if it's going to make any huge difference right away, but it's not a bad card in control decks at all, and it can do some crazy combo stuff from time to time too, drawing you the exact sort of thing you're looking for. So its utility as a tutor in Warlock, its ability to fit into control in Warlock, both seem pretty fitting. And to me, it seems like it could make this thing considerably more playable for that class. So small change, of course, but I think a fairly significant buff to Wychwood Piper as well. And once again, that's pretty darn cool. So moving on to the next one here, we have a couple beast changes, and we got one in the positive direction and one in the negative direction. So up first, Northsea Kraken, now a beast. Northsea Kraken, not a card that gets played much in Constructed. It's in Wild format exclusively right now, of course. I don't think it ever pops up. It's been a great arena card in the past, but just not that popular in Constructed. The Beast tag could theoretically help it there a little bit, making it more attractive to things like Hunter or Druid, so perhaps it sees a little bit of play here or there somewhere. I still doubt it, but nonetheless, very much a buff, just in case somebody cares down the line. And a good change, too, for consistency's sake. Northsea Kraken should, in fact, be a beast. On the other side of things here, we have the Jungle Moonkin, which used to be a beast, but moving forward will no longer be a beast. And again, that's actually a good change. Moonkins are sentient creatures. They are not actually beast, although they look kind of beastly. They stand upright, they're humanoid, etc. And of course, we already have that precedent set, excuse me, in the Wychwood with the Darkshire Moonkin. That thing is not a beast moving forward, so Blizzard is going back, making sure those match up, and all Moonkins, presumably, moving forward, will not be beasts. Now, this is, in fact, a little bit of a nerf. In practicality's sake, not really, because I don't think anybody, or at least maybe one dude out there in the world, is technically playing Jungle Moonkin as a beast synergy card. I don't think it's ever really been utilized that way. I've tried to put it in a beast deck before in the past and never made it work myself. But nonetheless, technically a nerf, because if there is that one dude out there playing Jungle Moonkin in a beast deck, suddenly his deck isn't going to be as good as it once was. And that's a small sacrifice to make. I think it's a worthwhile sacrifice to make for the sake of consistency. It's okay to negatively impact a few for the greater good of everybody else in regards to Hearthstone. That said, we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. Not getting a dust refund for Jungle Moonkin, and I think that's a problem, because that one guy out there might have had his day ruined, and I think that sucks. So we'll talk about that more later, but nonetheless, a small nerf that, in my mind, is pretty low impact and certainly a worthwhile change. So both of these are actually good changes as far as I'm concerned. So moving on, there's one other beast change here, and this one's a little bit interesting, and again, for consistency's sake, and that is that Wychwood Grizzly, which is now a beast, will be remaining a beast. It's not going to change. It's still going to be a beast. but its artwork is going to get updated. So the artwork on the left on the screen you see right now is the current version of Wychwood Grizzly. And obviously, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Obviously, it looks rather ghostly and ethereal and spiritual. It's a glowing blue translucent beast, and they're going to update the artwork so that Wychwood Grizzly actually looks like a grizzly in the flesh. It's like a possessed, bewitched grizzly as opposed to a ghostly grizzly. And that's because Blizzard is taking a stance here where they're saying ghostly beasts aren't going to be beasts. They're ghosts. They don't count as beasts. And that's actually a precedent that has been set in the game previously. Things like Spectral Spider, the token that comes out of Haunted Creeper, was never a beast, which gave some problems for Hunter back in the day. Like, you always wanted those to be beasts for Hunter synergies, but they weren't. And that's because they were ghosts. They weren't beasts. The spider that they were hunting was a beast, but once it died and the ghost skittered out, it was no longer a beast, which makes sense. They were ghosts. Astral Tiger is another instance of this. Astral Tiger clearly looks like a ghost tiger, and although a tiger is a beast, an Astral Tiger is not a beast. So Wychwood Grizzly getting its art updated. Ghostly grizzlies aren't supposed to be beasts. And that all sounds great until you look at these cards. Ghostly Charger and Arphis. And they are both ghostly beasts, but they are going to retain the beast tag. And Blizzard addressed this in the announcement for these changes for Arphis's case. They said, look, Arphis, we know he's a ghost, but we're going to keep him a beast because it's really cool to see Arphis in the Zombeast pool, and we like that gameplay interaction. So, okay, that's not consistent, which this whole update's about consistency. I do like that they had at least a gameplay reason for that. They decided, like, look, we're going to value gameplay more than we're going to value consistency changes. Like, I think that's okay. That's a reasonable defense. They want people to have a good gameplay experience. They don't want to disrupt that much. The same logic can actually be applied to Wychwood Grizzly. They said they wanted it to stay a beast because of things like Katharina and Big Recruit Hunter. Very popular deck right now. They like that interaction, so they didn't want to just make it a non-beast like Astral Tiger and Spectral Spider. So they decided to update the artwork instead of the card text. And like, that's a really cool decision. I like that. They focused on the player experience and the gameplay experience first and foremost. When it comes to these ghostly beasts, I don't know that it really matters. Like, does a beast cease being a beast when it's a ghost? Like, some people will say, well, in World of Warcraft it does. It doesn't get the tag. But I don't really care too much about the World of Warcraft impact. I just want the game to have a good experience. And I don't know that going from a case-by-case basis here is all that bad. I mean, I wouldn't make Ghostly Charger a beast, probably. It doesn't look like or feel like it needs to be a beast. But hey, if Arphis is a beast, I'm okay with that if there's a good gameplay reason for it. With Ghostly Charger, there isn't. So I don't know the answers. It's not my job to know the answers on this one. I'm not going to propose the right solution here. I think Blizzard just needs to take a stance and you know, move with it, whether it's we're going to focus on gameplay first, we're going to have defensible reasons to keep ghostly beasts in the game. That's okay. That's fine. I'm not going to criticize. But the difference between Ghostly Charger and Arphis here is not taking a stance. There's no defense for Ghostly Charger currently. Maybe there will be one in the future that makes that make more sense. It honestly feels like they just forgot about Ghostly Charger, which would be a real shame if that's the case, because they're like, you know, it would take an hour basically to go through the game and find all of these instances. So if they made this updated announcement based on only an hour's worth of work, that's a real shame, right? Like, if they didn't spend at least a little bit of time to make sure they got this right and were thorough about it, that's pretty unfortunate. So I don't know how Ghostly Charger fell through the gaps there. I don't really understand it. Maybe somebody here in the comments will have an explanation for why these things are the way they are. Nonetheless, I think the Wychwood Grizzly change is good. It introduces some other questions and problems. Ultimately, I agree with the gameplay first decision. I'm okay to make sacrifices for things like Arphis, as long as there's a reason to do it. So finally, there's one last thing I want to talk about here. And that's a note that they put at the end of the announcement post that you'll read on the screen here. And it says, essentially, there will not be any Arcane Dust refunds for the altered cards in this update. It says, in this case, since power levels remain essentially unchanged, we will not offer a full Arcane Dust refund. And as you'll see here, I pulled out Jungle Moonkin because this is really the only card that went in a negative direction. I think every other change was essentially a buff to the card, or it remained the same in the case of Wychwood Grizzly. So for most of them, I agree they didn't need a dust refund. It was okay. They changed, but they didn't ever change in a negative direction. It wasn't going to ruin anybody's day. It wasn't going to break their synergy in any given deck. It was fine. But with Jungle Moonkin, theoretically, like I said, that one dude out there who really desperately loves his Jungle Moonkin Beast Druid deck, for whatever reason, suddenly has a card that isn't as good as it once was. And I think there should just be a hardline stance where anytime a card is changed negatively, anytime its ability to be played is very slightly altered in a negative direction, they should just award the full Arcane Dust refund. 100 dust, or 200 dust in the case you own 2 of these, is not going to break the bank for Blizzard. It's a free gesture of kindness and generosity to the player. It avoids any sort of problem where anyone could possibly be slighted in the least. So I just don't understand why it's so hard to offer 200 Arcane Dust for a card like Jungle Moonkin. It's even in wild format, so a lot of people have probably already disenchanted it if there's somebody who's desperate for dust in the first place. So at the end of the day, I just can't stand by this. I think you need to side with the player more and just be overly generous when it comes to these things. Like, err on the side of generosity, not on the side of greed, because there's really no reason not to. And yes, I know there's probably 0 people that are actually playing Jungle Moonkin Beast right now, but it's just more about the precedent. It's more about the mentality. It's more about setting that example and that trend so we know what to expect and that we don't ever feel like a card is ripped out from under us. And, you know, this is not the best example. I think we had a better example previously with things like Lanessa Sunsorrow, when she was altered and didn't give an Arcane Dust refund. That was a bit of a better example because that was a card that is more playable, it is more modern, more up-to-date, but it's the same exact thing happening again and again. A card being changed negatively, not resulting in a dust refund. And I think that's an unfortunate problem. So I don't like this. It's okay for the other, however many cards, but for Jungle Moonkin specifically, I think it needed a little bit of a dust refund. And that said, that wraps up my thoughts on the consistency updates and card buffs being introduced here. Actually, some pretty exciting stuff. This is something people have been asking for a really long time. I don't know that Mountain Giant and Molten Giant were at the top of the list. I think I've seen them mentioned before, but a lot of that beast stuff, people had questions about. I am really losing my voice, guys. Forgive me. And frankly, it's just good to know that Blizzard's paying attention and thinking about it and working to make the game at least a little bit better. I think it took them way too long because this is, at the end of the day, a 1-hour change. I could have fixed this in an hour, at least from a identifying it, writing it out standpoint. There might be a little bit more that goes into the back end in the code, but frankly, if it takes years to update one line of text on a card, that's a fundamental problem too. So I don't think there's really any excuse for how long it took. Nonetheless, still a good thing to see. So that said, if you guys have any thoughts, comments on this, you think it was good, you think it was bad, did they leave out other cards, should they have taken a different stance on some of these, of course, leave all those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.